Welcome to Art Pays Me. Today we have a special one, Julie Rosvall. So Julie was the voice we heard at the beginning of the Craft Pays Me series, and this time the microphone is being turned towards Julie. So Julie, what is it that you do?
I do a few things. My day job is for Craft Nova Scotia. I'm program director there, and I've been with the organization in some capacity since 2003, off and on. And from 2008, I've been there consistently. Um, Usually, my job would entail a lot of in-person events, which obviously this year, past 14 months have not been possible. But my job is to get craftspeople out of the public eye for the job I get paid for. But for myself, I am a knitter, spinner, weaver, dyer, and printmaker. So that's what I do when I have time in my own studio in the Gasper Valley. So I've had a little bit of time this year, but it's been with COVID. All of my other work for Craft Nova Scotia has certainly been sort of top of mind, just because we're trying to figure things out.
Yeah,
Um, but I'm certainly trying to make more time for my own work whenever I can.
right, right. So how did you find yourself in this medium in particular?
Um, I've always had an interest in craft, in particular,
Hmm.
working with my hands. From an early age, my mother was always taking me to Craft New Brunswick shows, or when we were in Ontario, shows of fine craftspeople, galleries, and I was always creative, and I loved art class. Was obviously my favorite place to be. I was never particularly, I didn't excel at any one thing, but I loved dabbling in everything. But as I got into my 20s, one of my neighbors was a weaver, and I fell in love with the process, because every step is very, you can finish one part and then move on to the next. So it's in little chunks, and you can feel very accomplished in small chunks, which, because I've always had a job where I needed to be out doing that most of the time, to be able to have a craft where I could sit down at the loom. So you won't be, people won't be able to see it, but you can. My loom is behind me. I could sit down for an hour, and I could have finished one bit. 6 inches of weaving or threading the loom or whatever. So that was very satisfying. And when I moved to Nova Scotia, I moved to Wolfville, and Wolfville was the home of Mary Black, she was the weaver, internationally. Really, she's known around the world because she wrote The Key to Weaving, and so that got me deeper into that world. And I met weavers here. Jackie Mackay was an incredible weaver in Wolfville, and I worked in her gallery, Summer House, the first year that I moved here, and was going to apprentice with her. But unfortunately, she got cancer and passed away, so that
Uh,
never happened. Um, so I've moved through textiles, through the weaving and into spinning and dyeing, and eventually to knitting, because I was partners in a yarn shop for a while. And we discovered very early on, because we thought we were going to be supplying weavers, there are way more knitters than there are weavers. So both of us, my partner and I, were weavers, and we quickly discovered that we had to learn how to knit better and fast, because if you're supplying knitters, they're going to come in and they're going to ask questions, and they want to know what needles to use and how to fix this hole in their knitting. And
Right.
so I had a crash course basically every time somebody walked through the door. I had to go over in the corner, and thank God we had the internet. I had to Google how to fix this. And that made me a a fairly good knitter in a very short amount of time. Even though I had knitted for years,
Hmm.
I didn't have that great a skill. So it was interesting to force myself to learn these things. So that's sort of how I ended up in the textiles. And then the printmaking, I had already had an interest in it. I The first time I printed anything was maybe grade 9 art class, and I
Okay.
think I still have that somewhere. Um, but I love the idea of marks on paper. And I remember going to a fundraiser at Ross Creek with my boss one time, and she put a bid in on a Bob Hainstock print that had no ink on it. It was just texture on paper. So you walked up to it and you saw these ripples,
Right. Cool.
and I was fascinated. This was probably maybe 2008, 2009. And that got me thinking about printmaking again and how I could incorporate my knits into printmaking. And then I went to see a show of Betty Goodwin, who was a printmaker who printed vests and boxes and birds' nests and gloves and just about anything using a method called soft ground, which is like a waxy coating on the plate. And then you put whatever the object is on and put it under pressure so it makes an impression. And then you can etch that. And so you see that shadow of the garment or the leaf or whatever it is you've put on this. Um,
Cool.
and you can ink it. And so that made me realize that knitting could really translate to the page. So I started trying to figure out how to do that in about 2009, 2010, and have been sort of slowly moving my way through it, and taking whatever time I can in between other things to learn.
Right. That's interesting. I'm not familiar with that process, so I learned something new.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. So, where did you actually grow up? Was it New Brunswick or Ontario?
It was so born in New Brunswick. Then I think maybe when I was a toddler or a couple of years older, I think a year in Montreal, back to New Brunswick, Ontario for 2 years, back to New Brunswick, um, and then here to Nova Scotia as an adult. Um,
Okay.
yeah, it's so yeah, mostly New Brunswicker with a little Ontario and Quebec in there. Um, but yeah, Riverview was sort of most of where I was in New Brunswick for my up until my teens. So
Got you.
yeah.
Got you. So you kind of remind me of me in that like you fill your time with a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I have a habit of that. I do have a habit. I certainly have always had a love for bringing people together is
Hmm.
my favorite thing. I have a friend who she's the opposite. She's like wants to keep all her worlds separated. It's like she needs barriers between each of the sections, and I'm like, I want everybody in the same room at the same time. I want to see how everything interacts. So yeah, I've always done that from an early age. So I was the kid in grade 10 who got all of the potentially artistic people together to make a 15-foot by 15-foot James Dean panel for the back of the Grease play for theater, that sort of thing, and doing organizing recitals for my friend who was a pianist when I was in grade 12, and little art shows at the cafe I worked at. So
Hmm.
I always had that sort of you know desire to bring people together. And I guess I've always described it as I'm the cheerleader. I'm the
Right.
one who tells people about these amazing artists or craftspeople, or this thing that's happening in the community. And that's sort of where my focus has always been throughout my life,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah. So, what kind of advice would you give someone, a craftsperson today?
Oh, that's a tough one. Um, be a part of your community.
Mm,
I think that's huge. You can't, like, being alone in your world, and a lot of us are so much. When you're working on things, you do spend a lot of time alone.
yeah.
um, but engage with your community, and that can be both your fellow craftspeople, it can be the people who buy your work, it can be the people who are your cheerleaders, government organizations, you name it. I think you need to, if at all possible, if that's possible for you, to be a part of that community, and interact with people. I think that's huge, because the only way that we all learn and grow is to be with other people. So for a printmaker, if I didn't have community, I wouldn't have been able to complete this project and get these works up on the wall and have a show, because I wouldn't have known Bonnie or been comfortable enough to talk to her about the problems I was having,
Yeah.
and get her help and her offer me help, because she knew that I'm the type of person who will go out and help anybody that I can. So she was ready and willing to reciprocate. So I think that that's how you grow as a person generally.
Yeah.
Uh, and in the craft world, I think it's pretty critical, because it is a small world,
Hmm.
and if you want to make it your livelihood, you need to know, the craftspeople I know who are the most successful, are very open with their knowledge and their skills and their experience. They don't keep those things close to their chest, you know and hoard them. They share them, like, infinitely,
Yeah.
and they are the most successful people that I know, because they want they want to. There was, oh god, I'm gonna get tear. I So Life's Work series that I talked about earlier was a series of short documentaries that featured master artisans here in the province, and one of the subjects was Heather Lawson, who was a stone carver, and she passed away a couple of years ago. And so I'm so grateful that we have that project, that Craft Alliance and Craft Nova Scotia and Ben Proudfoot of Breakwater Studios and ACOA and Film and Creative Industries all came together and they made this project happen. And we now have this beautiful little nugget of a film about Heather and the other craftspeople too. They're all important, but Heather
Mm,
in particular, because she's now gone. One thing she says in that, and she said in life generally, was you don't want to make it harder for the people coming up behind you. And I think she experienced that a lot as a woman in a very male dominated career as a stone carver, um, but she was always drilling that into people. You want to make it as easy for the people coming up behind you as you can,
mm.
because that's what makes this an interesting world, is to lift other people up. So I think about that a lot and about her a lot.
I love that. That's wow.
Yeah, she was. Oh, if you people need to see the whole Life's Work series, but Stone in particular. You hate to have favorites, but I definitely, that one for me is just amazing. Her story and her as a person, she's brilliant.
Wow.
And I miss her.